You could sit in the front. You could. I mean, what have you to lose? I have not stood in front of a group of people at EOU since October anyway. And so it's a little bit intimidating to be here. I see, yes, students who recognize me, despite my effort to be incognito. But thank you all for coming out tonight. There are so many things happening on campus today that are competing with this event, and the fact that anyone is here tonight is something I am deeply grateful for. So thank you all for being here. And thank you to the library, to Karen Clay, and the rest of the staff here. Am I speaking loud enough? Is everything good? Okay, good. So, and also to the EOU staff who showed up to set up before the reading and to break down after. So thank you all. A year ago, a word came to us from an editor about a young poet whose work we might enjoy. And that poet was Piotr Florczyk, and his debut collection of poems, East and West. Soon after, like maybe hours later, we were contacted about a collection of translations as well that he was going to publish soon by Anna Swierczynska. Anna Swierczynska. Almost. And that book was called Building the Barricade, which is her account of the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, which she was a part of as a resistance, not fighter, but as a nurse in a hospital in Warsaw. And then Piotr wrote and said, "Hey, all these books are coming out. Could I maybe do a reading?" And I said, "Yeah, this is perfect." Piotr himself was born and raised in Krakow, in Poland, and he moved to the U.S. when he was 16 years old on a competitive swimming scholarship, I think sponsored by Poland. And so he came to California and was a competitive swimmer in high school and then later at university. In addition to his translations of Swierczynska's poems, Piotr has translated or co-translated 7 additional collections of Polish poetry. He is the author of a chapbook, I think, Barefoot, and a volume of essays and photographs, a Los Angeles sketchbook. His literary mentor, Sandra Alcazar, who is an old friend of ours and a former classmate as well, in another century, said of Piotr's work, "Each day we wake and begin an interior dialogue about what is ethical and what is tolerable on this planet." Poet and translator Piotr Florczyk demonstrates in his lyrical evocations what that conversation might look like as he negotiates the distance between urban and wild, settled and migrant, Krakow and Los Angeles. Florczyk has published in many fine literary journals, among them the American Scholar, the Boston Review, Harvard Review, the Michigan Quarterly Review, the New Yorker, Notre Dame Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, Slate, Threepenny Review, the Times Literary Supplement, and many, many others. He holds a Master's of Fine Arts degree in creative writing from San Diego State University, has taught at numerous colleges and universities, and now studies in the PhD in Literature and Creative Writing program at the University of Southern California. My students and I conducted an interview today with Piotr that will appear on the Basalt website whenever I get it transcribed, like maybe in about 50 years. I'll try to do it sooner than that if I possibly can. And in that interview, we touched on many topics that are central to his work and his concerns. Of being a child at the end of the communist era, of the history of the 19th and 20th centuries and Poland's pivotal place in that history, of the situation of an immigrant poet writing in a language other than his native language, of learning to become an American writer by translating his own work and the works of others into English, of always seeing and moving and maybe even thinking in two directions, in two different ways at once. As he says in one of his short poems from East and West called In Praise of Trains, I love riding trains. Polish trains are so slow, they take you places you wouldn't visit otherwise. Sitting with my back to the engine, I see everything already said and done. We too can visit now, a place we might not otherwise visit, and see ourselves from a point of view different than what we may have ever imagined. Please join me in welcoming Piotr Florczyk to EOU.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Jody as well for having me here, and to all of you for coming out. It's my first time in Oregon. I've lived on the West Coast 22 years, but this is my first time up here, and of course it's raining, and I'm loving it. Oregon rain. I know I've already been told this side doesn't really get the rain, it's the other side, but nonetheless. Special arrangements, yeah, just for me, huh? So anyway, I'm just thrilled and delighted to be here, and thanks again. I will read a little bit of everything, if that's okay with you. I'll start with a short essay from this patchwork of prose and photographs that ends with a poem, and then do a series of poems from Building the Barricade by Anna Świerszczyńska. And I'll close with some of my own poems, including a very new poem, one that I wrote about a month ago. Don't let me forget. Sometimes I get in a zone and forget that I'm supposed to read something else too. So this is a piece called Tabula Rasa, and it deals with, as David mentioned, being an hexaphonic writer, a writer who writes in a language that's not his native, and also some of the very typical and common anxieties that as writers we all share. Here it is. There's a poem I know by a poet who shall remain unnamed, in which the poet engages in a dialogue with a blank sheet of paper lying on the table before him. He calls the page all the right things, like beautiful and kind and sexy. The page says nothing. When he touches it with his hands, it doesn't respond, but nor does it recoil in disgust. When he lowers his head, it doesn't mock him. He bows for so long that eventually his head falls hard onto the kitchen table. He's in pain, but from up close he gets to see the imperfections in the page, small flecks of discoloration, tiny wrinkles, and momentarily his failure to sweep the page off its feet with his words doesn't bother him. In time, aware that it no longer holds all the cards, the page invites the poet to come in. I'm about to wake up from my nap, it tells him. Why don't you make yourself at home? What a mésalliance. The poet, meanwhile, tired of courting the page, calls the page's bluff and withdraws. From this point on, the relationship can't even be called platonic. Rather, it's business as usual. My vocabulary is housed in an hourglass I keep turning over. Oh, how I wished it tipped onto its side and cracked open, spilling its contents. I could sort and sieve through the words at will, rather than having to hunt for the right one while it tries to slip away through the narrowing. The cat and mouse-like game is no secret to any writing artist. More often than I care to admit, I hear myself stuttering when I try to form a sentence. Even now, while I'm writing down these words, I feel like I'm about to run dry. Every word may be my last, and I don't mean that lightly, knowing well that someday, hopefully in a distant future, I will indeed utter my final word. What will it be? Eating good food helps, as does going out for a swim, not in the blue-green Pacific where the water is cold for most of the year, but in a chlorinated pool. Bouncing off the walls and following the black line on the bottom takes the edge off, though it doesn't make it easier to articulate what I feel after I escape death at the hands or feet of an overweight kid who's just cannonballed into the pool. There's always drink, I suppose, to help one unloosen his tongue, but who wants to drink by himself? I don't. Porn works from time to time, I hear, but I'm married and straight as an arrow. My neighbor, on the other hand, the one with whom I share a wall, is rather promiscuous, meaning he plays all kinds of music. His preferred tool of expression is an acoustic guitar, but instead of gently finger-plucking some Bach to the benefit of everyone around, he practices the same 3 power chords time and again. Like most walls that alter the landscape of their surroundings, our wall both divides and unites us. For I have no choice than to listen to him play the guitar, which is actually a lot more acceptable than when he plays stuff on his computer. Perhaps it's a good thing I get so little done. Unable to articulate half of what I feel and think, I bring back memories in hopes of populating my present with something that might eventually connect it to my past. In fact, one story does repeat itself. I'm 6 or 7 years old. I wear a flannel plaid shirt and extremely short shorts. I'm inside our family's apartment, which is small, with only one room, a bathroom, and a kitchen. I've taken some leftover pieces of plywood, which my dad had bought to build a new wardrobe for the hallway, and used them to erect an elaborate system of highways that stretch from the coffee table to the armchair and from the fold-up bed to the TV stand. My Matchbox cars love speed. I play for fun, sure, but also to help get people where they need to be. My miniature soldiers in particular go from one battle to another. Eventually, the living room comes to resemble a giant construction zone. Makeshift churches are built, as well as shops that offer every imaginable good. My parents like that I can entertain myself. Then, one afternoon, I trip, fall, and chip half of my front tooth. To preserve the enamel, we place it in a jar of milk. When, later, we try to reattach the piece, we can't find the right fit. Thank God this page had already been dirtied by the time I sat down to write on it. The few sentences among twice as many doodles remind me that I've been here before. Placing one word next to another and then adding some more in between, I see them as Lego blocks that are meant to click-snap together. If all I'm doing is building a new Tower of Babel, well, so be it. Among the languages I speak, Polish and English will always end up at the top. In the meantime, it's 3:15 p.m., Thursday afternoon. My wife will be home in less than 3 hours. We'll have dinner together. I'll have to cook it first. How does Mexican sound? Then watch some television. I'm not doing so well, am I? We'll go to sleep around 10. I'll pee at least once in the middle of the night. Will we dream? I don't know. So let me transition to Anna Świerszczyńska's Warsaw Uprising poems from this beautiful book done by Tavern Books out of Portland. And in addition to what David has already said about this book and its context, let me just say that it is really a triptych. There are about 101, 102 poems, and more or less the narrative progression, if you will, of the book follows the actual Warsaw Uprising. So it begins with this very enthusiastic call to arms, and then goes through the middle period, even though it, after about a week, it was pretty clear to everybody involved that the uprising was doomed. And then it ends, the last section of the book really deals with that approaching aftermath and its consequences. So I've selected poems from all three sections, and I'll read them in that order, so hopefully you can hear the narrative changing. And I'll read a couple of these in Polish too, so we can have some additional voices here with us. The last Polish uprising. We lament the hour when it all began, when the first shot was fired. We lament the 63 days and 63 nights of battle, and the hour when everything ended, when the place where 1 million people had lived became the emptiness of 1 million people. That's from the prologue. While building the barricade. We were afraid, building the barricade under fire. Barman, jeweler's mistress, barber, all of us cowards. The housemaid hit the ground holding a cobblestone, and we were very afraid, all of us cowards. Groundskeeper, stallholder, pensioner. The pharmacist dragging the toilet door hit the ground, and we got very scared. Smuggler girl, dressmaker, tram driver, all of us cowards. The boy from a reform school fell dragging a sandbag, and we got scared for real. Although no one forced us, we built the barricade under fire. They thought I died. They thought it was I who fell on the street corner under fire. They cried. I ran to the one who fell, wanting to take her away, but she was already gone. What was left was the body, somewhat similar to mine, no longer afraid of bullets. Night watch. At night, we stood together on guard, shivering from the cold, a young soldier and I. The entire tenement was asleep, some 80 people sleeping like the dead. Across the street, Germans. At night, we stood together on guard, ordering our hearts not to beat, so we could hear the hearts of our enemies beating in the dark. I carried bedpans. I worked as an orderly at the hospital without medicine and water. I carried bedpans filled with pus, blood, and feces. I loved pus, blood, and feces. They were alive like life, and there was less and less life around. When the world was dying, I was but two hands handing the wounded a bedpan. Waiting 30 years. I should say that Świerszczyńska had waited 30 years, in fact, to write these poems. He must have been 6'5", that young beanpole, cheerful laborer from Powiśle who fought in the hell at Zielna Street in the telephone company headquarters. When I was rebandaging his torn-up leg, he winced and smiled. When the war ends, we'll go dancing, little miss. I'm buying. I've been waiting for him for 30 years. Let me read this one in Polish. Czekam 30 lat. Miał chyba 2 metry ten młody drągal, ten wesoły robotnik z Powiśla, co bił się w piekle na Zielnej, w gmachu telefonów. Gdy przewijałam mu poszarpaną nogę, krzywił się, śmiał się. Jak się skończy wojna, pójdziemy potańczyć, panienko. Ja stawiam. Czekam na niego 30 lat. Conversation through the door. At 5 in the morning, I knock on his door. I say through the door, in the hospital on Śliska Street, your son, a soldier, is dying. He opens the door, doesn't unhook the chain. Behind him, his wife trembles. I say, your son asks for his mother to come. He says, his mother won't come. Behind him, his wife trembles. I say, the doctor let him have wine. He says, please wait. He hands me a bottle through the door, locks with the second key. Behind the door, the wife begins to scream as if she were in labor. An insurgent's shirt. An insurgent's shirt has lice. It stinks of the stench of the sewers. It stinks of the sweat of youth, of the sweat of battle and fear. He wanted to wash it, only there wasn't enough water, or a wash bowl for the water, or a house for the wash bowl. Later, the shirt was soaked with blood, and then people gave him a second, clean one when they laid him into a box of white boards. Thoughts of a 14-year-old nurse before sleep. If all the bullets in the world hit me, then they couldn't hit anybody else. And let me die as many times as there are people in the world, so they wouldn't have to die, even the Germans. And let nobody know I died for them, so they wouldn't be sad. And now in the original. 14-letnia sanitariuszka myśli zasypiając. Żeby wszystkie kule na świecie trafiły we mnie, to by już nie mogły trafić w nikogo. I żebym umarła tyle razy, ile jest ludzi na świecie, żeby oni nie musieli już umierać, nawet Niemcy. I żeby ludzie wcale nie wiedzieli, że ja umarłam za nich, żeby nie było im smutno. Here's the last poem I selected from the second part. I bury my enemy's body. Enemy, you too were afraid, though they gave you a great automatic rifle. The fear in your eyes died later than you. Your automatic rifle killed many people. You lined many people against the way until it was your turn to face the hour of human nothingness. Children will cry after you. You were good to your children. Enemy, I bury your body in this ground which you stained with blood. The ground will accept you as if you were not its enemy. I'll read 4 more of these. This is from part 3. Man and Centipede. I will survive. I'll find the deepest basement, shut myself inside, won't let anybody in. I'll dig a hole in the ground, chew out the bricks. I'll hide in the wall. I'll go into the wall like a centipede. Everyone will die, and I will survive. They walk through the sewers. This poem, the title of this poem may sound familiar to some of you if you've seen Andrzej Wajda's great film, Kanał. Anybody seen that film? So it's a film about what this poem describes, which is in the last, so the uprising lasted 63 days, but the last 45 or so of it was simply about the insurgents just trying to hold to every piece of ground they could. It was really street combat. And with time, what happened was they were isolated. All that was left, in fact, were isolated pockets of resistance in the city. And the only way to get out of those encirclements was to go into the sewers and travel underground. And so Andrzej Wajda's great film is about that experience in a very allegorical way, too. It really hints at the experience not just of the fighters and the civilians, but the country as a whole. They walked through the sewers. They walked through the sewers. She carried him on her back, chest deep in reeking feces. In darkness, with no air, she stumbled on corpses of those who drowned. She clung to slippery walls, crawling with rats. She said, "Lieutenant, sir, hold on to my neck. It won't be much longer." Lost, they walked through the sewers. She carried him on her back for 10 hours. When she came up to the street below the sky on a clear night, the nurses said, "You brought a corpse." A girl says to a boy, "Come to the basement. There's no one there. Tomorrow the Germans will finish us off. We won't break through. They'll finish us off. There's only 2 grenades left. Come to the basement. It's dark there. Don't mind the rats. Rats everywhere. Cuddle up to me. You too tremble. I know you don't love me. I am wicked. If my mother knew. Don't say anything. Tomorrow we might die. I'm afraid. Say a prayer for me. You don't love me. Say a prayer for me. I'll say a prayer for my mom and for you. One more question about the movies. The Pianist. How many of you have seen The Pianist? Yeah, Władysław Szpilman, The Pianist, right? Do you remember the last scene where he plays the piano in the ruins in the rubble of Warsaw? And there's a German officer who helps him out. Well, this poem's called A German Officer Plays Chopin. A German officer walks through a dead city. His boots thump, so does the echo. He enters a dead house. There's no door. At the threshold, he passes bodies of dead people. He walks up to a piano, strikes a key. The sound sails through broken windows out into the city. The officer sits down, plays Chopin. The very new poem I'll read at the end also references Poland's favorite son. Still life with apples. When you first bite into a hard green apple and the tart juice runs down the stubble on your chin and neck, you realize you know nothing about how it ended up in the fruit bowl you got as a gift. So you think up an orchard and a farmer driving a tractor, baskets, ladders, knives, a sun that rises and sets over pockmarked hills. This isn't your life. The trees change color with the apples. You know you couldn't look after them, but you try. Come out, you worm, you say to the bruised hole at the center. Then you bite around it and wait for something to answer. So I was born and raised in Krakow, Poland, on a, for lack of better words, one of those Soviet-looking housing estates, apartment buildings. And so I think of myself as a city kid through and through. But for a few years, my wife and I got to live in Delaware, where we owned a townhouse that had a little backyard in the back, and a front yard too. And the issue was that we tried to grow something in the back, and nothing would take. And this poem is sort of inspired by that experience of trying to not so much be somebody I'm not or wasn't at the time, but really trying to become one of the place and with the place. It's called Backyard. It's my first, and everyone I know is already here, or waiting in line to get in. Ants, spiders, earthworms, even a pair of field mice with BB gunshot wounds who show up at dusk. Same as newlyweds, they bring suitcases full of sticks, tinfoil scraps, dead flies, and walnut shells packed like coffee cans with grass seeds. If things go well, they will soon settle in the nooks of the trench, quarry the rocks, build a shanty town in the shape of the orange cable I cut when I tilled this hill. May is beautiful here. They will turn the young Pachysandra into tables and chairs. And why not? This place is growing on me too. It's near the tracks, fenced in by tall weeds, half a mile from the twirling barber pole. Go on now, climb over my callous foot, between the muscled roots, you gypsies of the soil. I whisper as they disappear, come knocking again. And when I peek under the quilt of lawn, I see rooms, hands waving in the air. So during our interview earlier today, we talked about this at length, about a sequence of 7 poems. The poem is called From the Life of Postage Stamps. And as the title indicates, it's inspired by stamp collecting and trying to animate or breathe life into trees, plants, national heroes, athletes, what have you. So let me read you a couple of these poems. This is the one my mother-in-law likes. It's called The Kitchenware.
Good for her.
Between the fork, spoon, knife, and my favorite, the two-faced meat tenderizer, an entire commando force can be assembled. No one beats the wiry egg beater or the black spatula, even the fruit processor shoved behind the Dutch oven. A jar opener is for sissies who've never squeezed a tennis ball. Better they stick to the frying pan or the wooden citrus reamer. Tongs are fine for dealing with sauerkraut or Polish sausages, but they share a drawer with the measuring cups that often go missing. Still frying noodles in a wok is easier than it looks. The peeler loves the grater the way the heirloom teacup loves the saucer. The carafe of icy water is a beauty. From the center of the table, it reflects sunlight onto the plates and mugs of mortals. The fighter ace. I tried hard, long and hard, to get away from you. Though somehow I always managed to do the split on the wing and hurt myself, climbing into my shiny Messerschmitt. Those were the days. I ran out of fuel after takeoff, once. The sight of the green grass forever embossed on my mind. I learned to waterland in dry season. They called me son of a gun, but I was more than that. The Cuban 8, the Chandelle. On my first mission in '39, I pulled off the Immelmann only to lose my way back to base. There's beauty in staring at the world, but from the air, all rivers look the same. My own fate was sealed when they called off the search. Go ahead, hold me, but you can't lick me unless you mean it. You can have my Iron Cross, rusty though it is. In turn, I ask that you don't flap your arms at every plane that flies by. Just read a couple more. Tetris. As I mentioned, I've been here in the States for 22 years. But the first 10 years of it, every time I went back to Poland, I insisted on visiting some of the old apartment buildings we had lived in when I was a kid. And so this poem records that experience of going into a 5-story block and remembering different things happening at different stories. Tetris. While searching for a place to eat our sandwiches of honey ham, Swiss cheese, we came to the edge of a tract I once lived in, unsure why I had left, unsure why thistles grew where a bike path had been. And leaving you to guard the gate, I went inside a 5-story block, pretending I didn't know the way. But the staircase remembered my stride. Its wooden planks creaked and squeaked as I climbed slowly, holding on to the wrought iron rail. The air was thick with flies, the smell of fresh tar sizzling on the roof where, years ago, we'd go to spit on people's heads and tweak the antennas to catch somebody else's dreams. Life was beautiful, I thought, leaving the first floor. I found my misspelled nickname carved into the wall. The second story, too, held a secret I would never forget. The teenage years, boys chasing girls. The painted shut window with the view of the church. The hollow spot under the stairs where she told me I had to take my clothes off before she would hers. After she unplugged the extension cord, the light bulb that dangled above went out, shivering stars around us. Out of breath, I cleared my throat, pushed on. Arriving on the third story, I wondered what became of Peter and Paul. They started shaving in junior high, grew to be 6'4". I'd heard they followed the dusty footprints their father left, coming home at night, and got a job underground. Who knows? They might well be in Dublin or Belfast, tossing back pints in an empty pub. No wonder the 4th floor was a blur, and the 5th why I came. But when I rapped my white knuckles on the door, The brownish leatherette cover caved in under my wedding ring. So I checked the address again. Apartment 9, last building on the right. Dead end, street lined with lilacs. Check, check, check. I flipped through memories, hoping to see the familiar eye pluck the Judas hole, hear the turning of the locks, the clinking of the chain, lifted and unhooked, dropped. Let me close with a short poem called Rain. Yes, hopefully you'll chuckle at this one. Rain. It's been raining non-stop for 5 days in Los Angeles. And hardly any driver thinks it's important to turn on the headlights. In Europe, for example, they keep the lights on year-round. Should we applaud? While ruin invites rumination, light doesn't always wait at the end of the tunnel. For now, waiting down Bundy, men in orange smocks keep dead leaves from clogging the drains. All other escape routes appear passable. This really happens, you know? But turn on the lights, I can't see you. Thanks again for coming out. I'll close with this poem. It's called Second Language. And it's a poem about the very fraught relationship between Polish Catholics and Polish Jews. Very complicated, complex history past that many of us are working to improve and to move forward. And this poem mentions Chopin as well. And there's a quote here, with a small hand. And it's a quote from a poem by Gottfried Benn, the German poet, translated by Michael Hoffman. And Benn's poem is called Chopin. And in that poem, Ben describes or characterizes Chopin as this very diminutive man composing his polonaises and mazurkas with a small hand. So that's where I got that. There are a couple other references here. You don't need my explaining them, really. Second language. It's rained for so long that I haven't left the couch in days. Poets sprawl across me, predicting the world's end. Will it come with a bang, or tomatoes ripening on the vine? Feeble-hearted Chopin practices his funeral march with a small hand. My next-door neighbors, dinner time, don't mind the rain, or that our initials disappear from the curb. After reading Mouse, I look in the mirror and see a pig made in art's image. Then I read it again, backwards, but the same frayed speech bubbles hover over my head. The pit of smoldering questions grows deeper. Years ago, in Warsaw, I went to see that heart. Stowed away inside the first pillar on the left, it is the thing that keeps the world from falling apart. Thank you.
There are some books for sale. Do you want to answer some questions?
Sure, I'll answer questions, yeah. I do not, but some of my work has been translated into Polish by other people. And twice now I've had the experience of being in Poland at a reading when those poems were read in Polish after I first read them in English. And I can just say it's like an out-of-the-body experience because you know the poem, so you know what's coming, you know the language, and yet you also realize that it's no longer your poem, that it's its own little thing that the translator creates and created. So I think if I attempted to do it myself, I would probably change things. Maybe I would feel like I have the liberty to change things because I'm translating it myself. And then just one other thing about that. So the very first time I got to hear my poems in Polish, I was in Krakow, and my parents were in the audience, and my parents live in Poland. They never came here, and there I was. I got up and I started reading my poems in English, and I thought, what a strange experience. And there's my parents, and they don't understand a word I'm saying, and then my friend stood up and read the translations, and you know, I could see my parents in the audience, and it was just a really strange experience because I could tell they were responding to the translations, obviously not to my poems because they couldn't understand what I said. Yeah. Thank you.
So when you're doing the new edition, so it is more like writing poetry. You're not just, I've never done translation. Are you actually your poems, your translation?
You mean when I translate somebody else's work? Yeah, good question. So I try to be as faithful to the original as possible. Other translators, you know, are not or may not be or may feel like they can take liberties, add things, change things. I'm not against it, but I believe that then those should be called versions or imitations, versions really, rather than translations. Yeah. So sometimes you can't, sometimes you have to change things, but it's usually minor things. In my case, changing the order of the lines to preserve the rhythm or the cadence of the line. But there are known cases where people have changed words and thus meanings of poems for one reason or another. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes? So I don't write in Polish anymore, other than emails, etc. I did the most recent writing in Polish that I've done was I was a columnist for a Polish language newspaper in New York, and so I had a monthly. It started out as a weekly, and then it became a monthly column in that paper. And when I was first approached to take on this assignment, I said, no, I can't do this. You know, I hadn't done any writing in Polish in years. My Polish, I think, has grown a little stale because I don't use it on a daily basis. My wife doesn't speak Polish, so we don't speak Polish at home. And then it was one of two things. I either had the greatest time because I felt like I could just do whatever I wanted, or was the opposite. I felt really kind of smothered by the assignment and couldn't really get a proper sentence on the page. It was never in the middle. It was always very extreme. Lots of fun, or wow, how do I do this? How does this sound? My syntax is off. Grammar. Wow, how do you spell this word? It doesn't. It doesn't. I don't. That doesn't happen to me. No. It's usually. Somebody once said that a poem begins off the page, in the mind, and I think in English on a daily basis, not in Polish. My Polish kind of comes on either because I hear it, or I'm talking to someone, or I'm reading newspapers, because I do quite a bit of reading in Polish still. But the thinking about poetry and the art, trying to communicate something, all of that process takes place for me in English rather than Polish. So I don't ever question whether or not this poem or this line would sound better in Polish. And then your second question, yeah. I do not, no. Translating the book. So the main challenge of translating Anna Świerszczyńska's work was not to over-translate the poems. And what I mean by that is not to overwrite them. So if I were given just a kernel of the poem, the gist of it, and then somebody asked me, why don't you write a poem of just, I don't know, like a writing assignment. You have 5 lines, write about this. The challenge was to reproduce the minimalism, sparseness of these poems, rather than maybe be tempted to raise the stakes a little bit by choosing a word that's a little louder, for instance, or one that uses or introduces or would introduce a different rhythm into the poem. And time again, I had to hold back and really stop myself from, again, what I call over-translating, which essentially means overwriting the translation with my own personal input. Because, not so much because I was afraid that people would not understand or wouldn't be able to appreciate the poem, but because, sometimes you think that poetry should communicate very directly, or that it should be pretty, or it should sound great. And when you translate poems that do not, that's one of the challenges. How do you reproduce the kind of flatness, bluntness of these lyrics? Thank you. Are you asking if that happens for me, or in general, if somebody's learning? In general, I guess. Yeah. I mean, you guys are native speakers of English. You know this better than I do. But the grammar of American English is kind of pitiful. It's very impoverished. There's hardly anything that you can do with it. It's the vocabulary that we love, right? The very extensive vocabulary, words, and 20 different words for the same verb, etc. Well, in Polish, it's the opposite. The vocabulary is still pretty extensive, but the grammatical structure is really rich and allows for sorts of syntactical play. Any other questions? Yeah. Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. Polish is a. It's not protected. I know what you mean. You mean if the government has done anything to keep it pure and very Polish. They have not. In fact, it's been the opposite because of the country playing catch up with, the business world and the business speak. It's not uncommon to go to Poland and. The business jargon is there, and it's everywhere. But you also hear it on television. You see it on storefront displays and marquees and such. So, and then having said that, it's also important, I think, to remember that it's a language that has a lot of borrowings as it is, And sometimes I play that game. You know, how many words that people use in Poland on a daily basis, how many of them are from other languages? And the list just keeps getting longer and longer and longer. English, French, lingua franca, very important. Lots of French words in Polish. English too, but mostly because of business and entertainment. Some Russian words as well, even though the two Slavic languages, they belong in different subgroups of Slavic languages, so they're actually very different. It's one of those false positives, you know, when you kind of hear it and you say, oh, that sounds, you know, I think I could talk in this language. Well, you really couldn't. Yeah, because there may be some sounds that are similar, but they're really not. But that was my second language. When I was a kid, we had no English in school until I think I was in 7th or maybe 8th grade. There was Polish, of course, Polish literature, and then in 3rd or 4th grade, we all had Russian. So I had Russian all the way through my freshman year of high school. And so I can read it, but I would never go up to a Russian speaker and start speaking in Russian, even though I could probably wing it. Czech or Slovak? Yes, because the three are a little bit closer. Yeah. Yes, sir?
Question for you about your relationship, if there is one, with Conrad.
Yeah, what a great question. So he's my patron saint, you know. Yeah, so Joseph Conrad, you know, the Polish man who became the great English novelist. Yeah, I love his work, you know. You know, he had it harder than I, you know, because he didn't learn English till he was in his 20s. Of course, he had French since he was very little. But sure, I mean, in Krakow, there are two major international literary festivals each year. The one in June is dedicated to the poet Czesław Miłosz. And then there's one in October that's dedicated to Joseph Conrad, because it was from Krakow that he set out. You know, he came from Ukraine to Poland, Krakow, and then went to France. Yeah, great question. Yeah. Yes. You mean why do I write in English? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, like any immigrant, you come to a new country, you know, new culture. You want to fit in. You want to belong. So you know, you try to assimilate.
Plenty of people in the military, they went to Germany for 6 years, didn't know what part of war Germany. So
Yeah.
I guess it depends on the person.
Yeah. And so, well, in my case, you know, again, it was a little easier for me because I live with a host family. You know, my parents were not around, and I think, you know, had they come with me, or had we all come, it would have been totally different. We probably would have continued to speak Polish at home. I didn't have that option. You know, I had to speak English the second I got off the plane, and I got picked up by my host family in their giant, whatever, Suburban. I forget what make of a car that is. Chevy Suburban, I think. You know, it's like, whoa, look at that thing. You know, looks like a little truck. Well, and yeah, so I lived with the host family for 3 years in high school. And I came here in 1994, and what I'm getting at is that was before internet, you know, before Skype, and you know, I talk to my parents via Skype every week now, but back then it was sending letters home and hoping to receive a letter, you know, maybe at least once a month. And I went to school, and the first semester of high school I was taking ESL classes, and then after that first semester I tested out and was put in with the general population, so to speak. Yeah. Any other questions?
I tell you, maybe you're closer, that you are the second Polish poet to be here. In 1983.
Yeah, which is amazing. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, that would have been, what, 3 years after the Nobel Prize, right? So, yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, huge deal, yeah. Yeah. Thank you again.